So this talk is entitled The Predictability of the Family Emotional System. I'm RandallT Frost. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, where I direct Living Systems, which is a pastoral counseling center that uses Bowen theory as our primary approach to counseling and therapy, as well as in our training. Well, predictability is a hallmark of science. One of the most important tests of any theory is the theory's ability to account for the observations of a phenomenon that's under study and to predict how the phenomenon will behave under certain conditions. The two presentations this afternoon are intended to explore ways in which Bowen theory enables a clinician to make predictions about what Bowen came to call the family emotional system. This first talk is about the theory and how a thorough knowledge of the theory and accurate observations about the functioning of a particular family can enable a clinician to make if-then predictions about the outcome of a therapy effort. If certain definable variables can change, the family can change, and functioning can improve. The second part of the afternoon is a clinical interview with a woman who began learning Bowen theory 5 years ago in our training program. The interview took place a year ago for a clinical conference held at the Bowen Center. Taken together, this first presentation on theory, followed by the clinical interview, will hopefully illustrate some ways in which the concepts of the theory enable predictions of how the family will function under specifiable conditions. So Bowen wrote a bit about predictability and his theory. He said a theory of behavior is an abstracted version of what has been observed. And if the theory is accurate, it should be able to predict what will be observed in other similar situations. He went on to say that my primary effort has gone into making psychotherapy as scientific and predictable as possible. He had a research methodology that he used at the National Institute of Mental Health, and that involved bringing entire families on the ward of a research hospital in which a young member of the family had schizophrenia. And what he did was he tested initial hypotheses he had about the development of schizophrenia with observations of how the research families actually functioned on the research ward where they lived 24/7 and in what came to be called family psychotherapy. If a predicted result based on the working hypothesis was not forthcoming, either the therapist was not functioning consistent with the hypothesis, in which case the functioning of the therapist was modified, or the hypothesis itself was at fault, and the hypothesis was modified, and the family psychotherapy was brought into line with the modified hypothesis. This back and forth movement between developing hypotheses and observed outcomes occurred hundreds of times over the years and led to a theoretical therapeutic system that was developed as an integrated unit, with psychotherapy determined by theory. This research methodology was extended really throughout Bowen's career to families with less severe problems and even to understand the functioning of families without diagnosable problems at all. Some of the same patterns that were observable in families with a severe problem were also observed in families with less severe problems The differences was the intensity of the process and the degree to which it was fixed versus more flexible. So the theory, as it came to be finished, had two main variables. One was the degree of integration of self. Dan Papero talked about that earlier today for those who were here for it. And that has to do with the integration of the emotional system, the feeling system, and the intellectual system. The emotional system is the part of us we share with the rest of life. The intellectual system is most highly developed in the human. And the feeling system is the aspects of the emotional system that become into awareness. Bowen defined the emotional system as said, an intimate part of that which we share with the rest of living things, governed by the same laws. The emotional system of the individual refers to the part of the brain that handles all the stimuli from the different organs, as well as from the sensing organs that perceive the environment and relationship with others. As defined by Bowen, the emotional system includes all the automatic functions that govern the autonomic nervous system, synonymous with instinct that governs the life process in all living things. Let's see, we missed one here. The intellectual system is the function of the cerebral cortex, appeared last in our evolutionary development. Main difference between man and lower forms of life involves the ability to think, reason, and reflect, and enables the human to govern his life in certain areas according to logic, intellect, and reason. Every human being has an intellectual system that is more or less developed, more or less able to hold its own with the emotional system. And as I said, the feeling system is a link between the emotional system and the intellectual system through which certain emotional states are represented in consciousness, and all of us have feeling systems. While every member of our species has an emotional system, an intellectual system, and a feeling system, Bowen observed far more of life is governed by the automatic emotional forces than man is willing to acknowledge. Nonetheless, he found that all people fall on a continuum in the degree of fusion or relative differentiation between emotional and intellectual functioning. He called that continuum the scale of differentiation. Differentiation of self is the cornerstone variable of the theory. It has two broad aspects. One, the degree to which people can distinguish between a more objective thinking process and a more subjective feeling process, and to have more of a choice on which one to follow in stressful situations. So that ability to choose between a more subjective and a more objective process is very much at the heart of the individual aspect of differentiation. But there's also a relationship aspect to it. And that has to do with the degree to which people either merge or fuse into one another in a close emotional relationship. That has to do with people, families, sort of functioning as if it's hard to tell where one person stops and the other person starts. An upset in one person quickly transmits to an upset in the other as if they were a single organism. And so two individuals begin to function as if they were one. It's the emotional system that makes human behavior predictable. That's the part of us that's automatic. And every concept of the theory refers in part to the emotional system. The second main variable in the theory, in addition to differentiation, is degree of anxiety. That has to do with an emotional response to a real or perceived threat. The stress response would be a good example of that. And the anxiety varies in terms of how intense it is, how long it lasts, whether it's acute or chronic, and different kinds of anxiety. The anxiety can be generated by relationships itself, the sense that you're losing yourself in an intense relationship generates anxiety for you and often for others, as well as stressors that place demands on a family and individuals to adapt to the demands of the stressor. So the relationship system can evoke chronic anxiety when you're in fixed patterns of relating that are stressful, as well as events outside the person and the family that make demands on the family to deploy their energy and their resources to try to meet the demands of those stresses. There's an interaction between level of differentiation and level of anxiety. They each influence the other, and they both interlock with every other concept of the theory. These two main variables, as they interlock with the other concepts of the theory, provide the basis for predicting family functioning and clinical outcomes of family therapy. Bowen comes at differentiation from a number of angles. One is what he calls the functional level of differentiation. And this is the degree of fusion between the emotional and intellectual functioning that's not fixed, but influenced by the level of anxiety in self and in the system. So the more the anxiety, the more people are vulnerable to having the emotional and feeling and the intellectual system sort of fused together with the emotional system more in charge. Under lesser conditions of stress and anxiety, it's a little easier to retain thoughtful, objective thinking and functioning. He talks about basic level of differentiation as estimated by taking the average of functional levels under calm and stressful conditions. So to diagram it, here is a scale of differentiation with the basic level of differentiation sort of at a mid-range point. And the functional range can go above or below the basic level. So under more optimal conditions, low anxiety, not caught in stressful functioning position in the family, you can function above the basic level. But under pressure, under stress, or under disadvantaged functional positions, you have a functional slide in the scale below your basic level. So this is a range, and this is sort of average function. Under more optimal conditions, under more stressful conditions. Another way he comes at the idea of differentiation is distinguishing between solid self and pseudo-self. The solid self is the part of us that's made up of clearly defined beliefs, opinions, convictions, and life principles on which we will take action even in situations of high anxiety and stress. So it's non-negotiable, no matter how much stress or pressure we're under. Pseudo-self, on the other hand, is made up of beliefs and principles that are acquired from others, that are negotiable in relationships to others, to enhance our image, to make us look better, or to actively oppose the other person. But they're not thought through. They're not really incorporated by our more objective thinking process. It's more of a subjective emotional process in which we take on the beliefs of family, of church, of society, without really thinking them through and making them our own. As such, they're negotiable, They can buttress our functioning under good conditions, but they dissolve under pressure. So again, if we put solid self and pseudo-self on the scale, pseudo-self One's parallel functional level, gain pseudo-self under optimal conditions, lose it under pressure, time. The solid self put at the bottom of the range of function. It's the part of us that kicks in to halt the regression when we're under stress or pressure. When we reach a point where we say, this far, no further. This isn't consistent. I'm not going to go along. When that can happen, a functional slide can stop and keep it from developing even further than it has. Emotional triangles are important in the theory. And an emotional triangle is a three-person configuration that's Bowen called the molecule or basic building block of any emotional system. And the operation of these emotional triangles can be predicted when you know the system well. So here, would be a typical triangle in low anxiety conditions. Two people are able to have a close relationship. Third person on the outside feels left out. This is the more uncomfortable position. Togetherness is the comfortable one. And C may able to get into a togetherness of A, which means B on the outside. These kinds of shiftings go on all the time in emotional systems. It's when they get more fixed and less flexible that it begins to create a problem, particularly when it's more on the outside. Under modern anxiety, tension develops between these two. Now, this C is in a more comfortable position. And you two slug it out, be out of this. Because it's so uncomfortable, A may try to get out of that position by talking to C about what a problem B is for them. Or B rather. B can talk to C about what a problem A is for them. And that can result in an attention shift between A and C instead of between B and B in the more complicated. Mother or child gets into it, and the mother says, wait till dad gets home. And so she tells dad what's going on, and dad gets into something with the mother more comfortable outside. With enough stress and anxiety, can't be contained in three people, and we get interlocking triangles. The D is pulled in, we get after the G sometimes. So the tension and anxiety spills out from the family to involve others, social institutions, the police, what have you. Another way Bowen comes at differentiation of self is these two counterbalancing life forces that you've heard about already today. These run deep. Individuality is a life force. To be a productive, autonomous individual is defined by the self rather than the dictates of the group. The togetherness life force is the universal need for emotional closeness, love, approval, and agreement, the togetherness. And these counterbalance one another. And depending on your level of differentiation, those balances are more in equilibrium with each other, with closer to equal. Under greater pressure or lower levels of differentiation, the togetherness force is much more in charge. So one way I've tried to portray that is this way of looking at it on a scale, so that here's 35, moderate level of differentiation. Individuality is above the horizontal line, represented by the vertical lines. You can see the line is much longer, representing togetherness. At very high levels of differentiation, very low levels of differentiation. There's very little individuality. It's overwhelming sensitivity to relationships. That's right. But this can also be affected by anxiety. When anxiety is low, it's easier for the individuality force to emerge. Somewhat counterbalance the evidence force. Crank up the anxiety, and the evidence force begins to dominate the ability to solve those conditions. Now, one of the most important functioning patterns in a family has to do with what Bowen called the intensity of the unresolved emotional attachment to parents, most frequently to mother, for both men and women. All things being equal, he said, the life course of people is determined by the amount of unresolved emotional attachment, the amount of anxiety that comes from the unresolved attachment, and the way the person and the family deal with the anxiety. The degree of unresolved emotional attachment to parents is equivalent to the degree of undifferentiation that must somehow be handled in a person's own life and in future generations. Unresolved emotional attachment picks up the developmental process of differentiation. Infants gradually grow away from complete emotional dependence on the family, the parental family, and under good circumstances gradually assume increasing age-appropriate responsibility for self. But children vary in the degree to which their immature dependence on the family actually resolves by the time they leave home. Bowen wrote that the child is programmed into the family configuration very early in life, following which the amount of unresolved emotional attachment remains relatively fixed, except for functional shifts in the parents. Under favorable circumstances and with good fortune in the central family, the amount may become less. Under disastrous circumstances with high levels of parental anxiety, the amount of unresolved emotional attachment will be greater. In other words, the more chronic anxiety the family's experiencing, the harder it is to make an orderly resolution of that attachment to the family for the developing child. Bowen suggested that the intensity of the denial of dependence and pretense of independence in adolescence is a remarkably accurate index of the degree of unresolved emotional attachment to parents during adolescence. So when you have adolescents taking rather extreme positions, whether it's in dress or defiance or behavior problems, that's a pretty good index that there's a good deal of unresolved dependence, which the adolescence is trying to handle with a pretense, a pseudo-self of I'm independent, look at all this crazy stuff I can do. In adults, he suggested the principal manifestation of emotional cutoff is denial of the intensity of the unresolved attachment to parents, acting and pretending to be more independent than one is, and achieving emotional distance through internal mechanisms or physical distance. In other words, a fairly intense emotional attachment is uncomfortable. And one way to deal with that discomfort is by avoiding the original family or keeping one's contacts to a limit, to a minimum, or showing up but keeping it pretty formal and not terribly personal, so that the discomfort of that dependence doesn't kick in. Unresolved emotional attachments to a parent can remain viable for life, attach to future significant relationships, and continue to direct the course of a life. In broad terms, the amount of chronic anxiety in a family tends to parallel the degree of unresolved emotional attachment in the family. And then to repeat this quote that I gave earlier, all things being equal, the life course of people is determined by the amount of unresolved attachment, the amount of anxiety that comes from it, and the way people deal with this anxiety. But what is it really? What is unresolved emotional attachment? Bowen didn't offer a formal definition. He did write that the degree of unresolved attachment to parents is equivalent to the degree of undifferentiation. If you turn to the dictionary, the word attachment means to connect or to join to something. In Bowen theory, the term emotional refers to the part of the human we share with the rest of life, the more automatic part. And the term resolve means to distinguish between or make independently visible adjacent parts, to separate, or to deal with successfully, to make clear or understandable, to settle. So an unresolved emotional attachment suggests that an adult child has not successfully separated itself emotionally from his or her parents to a greater or lesser degree. And this understanding of unresolved emotional attachment is broadly consistent with Bowen's description of lack of differentiation from the parental family. More specifically, unresolved emotional attachment can be defined as emotional programming through family interaction. Dr. Kerr has come up with that particular formulation, which I think is useful. And he's gone on to suggest that this emotional programming results in sensitivities that can govern behavior through our need for attention from others, originally from our family, our sensitivity to the expectations of the family for our behavior, our sensitivities to and need for approval from the family, and the way we respond to distress or upset in the family, often by trying to relieve it, kind of automatically. So these ways that we get programmed in our original family and the sensitivities that we develop there then play out in other important relationships to our spouse, our children, and important people in our lives. And they go toward accentuating the togetherness, accentuating the emotional fusion in relationships. So some clinical examples of unresolved emotional attachment would be a husband who expects the same amount and intensity of attention from his wife that he received from his mother, and pressures her to provide it. A female whose functioning position in her original family was that of an over-responsible oldest anxiously replicates that functioning position as an adult with her own mother, grown siblings, husband, and adult children. So over-responsibility in one's original family translates into over-responsibility in other important relationships. Or a mother who functioned on the outside of a fixed triangle with her mother and younger sister unwittingly contributed to replicating that painful functioning position in the nuclear family she established with her husband. In each instance, the emotional programming from interaction in the original family replicates the same pattern of functioning in the new nuclear family. So how do we go about resolving unresolved emotional attachments? Bowen stated that which is learned in a relationship can be unlearned in a relationship. So going back into our important relationships in our original families and in current relationships, and developing the ability to be less automatically reactive, less programmed by the sensitivities, more able to think objectively and act on such thoughts when reporting to others is one way to begin to kind of deprogram our emotional sensitivities over time. Put differently, resolving unresolved emotional attachment entails slowly resuming the developmental process of differentiation. Dr. Papero spoke earlier today about increasing one's autonomy as one gets older, one's ability to act for oneself at one's own initiative, agency, the developing ability to become more competent in important areas of life, and to develop maturity as we enable our ability to self-regulate even under pressure. These 4 areas emphasize the growing individuality of people, where the tension, expectations, distress, and the like emphasize the more vulnerability to fused relationships. So moving toward developing greater autonomy, agency, competency, and maturity is contributing to modifying and eventually starting to resolve what's unresolved from the past in the present. So what are some markers toward resolving the intensity of emotional attachment? Well, a big one is how we think about ourselves in relation to other members of the family. If there's movement from one member of the family feeling and thinking they are responsible for fixing the problems of another, that blurs the boundary between self and other, moving away from that and toward responsibility for self in relation to other members of the family. Peggy Chan spoke of that just a little earlier this afternoon. Moving from an over-positive or over-negative focus on others toward a more objective view of the other and self is a marker of moving toward greater resolution of the attachment. Movement toward trying to understand and modify the part self plays in family problems. Again, the shift from focusing on others to focusing on self and our accurately understanding our part in patterns. Movement toward better containing one's anxiety and transferring less of it toward others is a good indicator, as well as knowing the difference between blaming self or others and taking responsibility for self. Blaming self or others is something that comes out of the emotional feeling system. Taking responsibility for self is a more cognitive effort to try to understand one's part and to modify it. Dr. Paparot's proposed dimensions of family assessment that also can serve as markers of resolving the intensity of emotional attachment. These include the family moving away from retreat toward challenges, toward actively engaging challenges. Members of the family, when they move from focusing on issues, I got an issue with you, to understanding the process that can get going in families around a particular issue. Moving from polarized opposition toward cooperative problem solving. Movement toward accessing resources both in the family and outside it. Leaders beginning to emerge within the family. And as I said, movement from transferring anxiety to others toward containment. Indicators of that can be movement from catastrophic thinking toward observing facts and making realistic appraisals of challenges. Movement away from anxious triangling toward person-to-person interaction and detriangling. Movement from the most anxious leading in a family to the least anxious leading. Now, chronic anxiety is generated by the lack of differentiation, unresolved emotional attachment, and that anxiety in families gets absorbed by marital conflict, emotional distance, projection of the anxiety to one or more children, and one spouse over-adapting to the other who gains strength in the process. Each of these mechanisms reflect failures in differentiation. And conflict implies that, I see it my way, you see it your way, but I'm right. And when you see that I'm right, our conflict will be over. And when both take that perspective, neither is respecting the other as an individual in their own right, but expecting the other to see things as kind of an extension of the way we see things. Emotional distance reflects lack of differentiation in that differences, sensitivities for a couple become too unpleasant to deal with directly, and so those areas of functioning, those matters get avoided, and distance can creep into a marriage as people avoid things that upset the other. Projection of anxiety to one or more children, that reflects a lack of differentiation in that the child is expected to function as an extension of one or both parents to help them reduce their level of discomfort by functioning in a way that bolsters the parent's own functioning. So that's sort of incorporating the child into problems of the parents rather than the parents dealing directly and responsibly with one another. And then one spouse over-adapting to the other. Again, it reflects a lack of differentiation in that one person is unwilling to kind of hold up for their point of view on matters of importance to them because they don't want to upset the other or have to deal with the other when they are upset. So again, these can be seen both as ways to absorb anxiety, but also reflect the lack of differentiation as it plays out in these mechanisms. So here's all four of these mechanisms represented in a diagram. Conflict, one person making more and more decisions for both, this one going along, becoming more vulnerable, as Dr. Frost spoke about earlier, various physical illness, certainly, but also psychiatric problems. Here's two lines, so just a moderate degree of fusion. The diagrams can have three, really even four. This is a kind of, okay, sure. So this is a less, of a connection. This one is freer to chart their own course. This one is functioning more as an extension of the parent than this one, but again, those can increase in intensity. So a marriage can start out with about equal level of the parents giving self to each other in terms of attention and approval and all those good things. But it's pretty balanced. The couple's in equilibrium and no particular symptoms. Something disrupts that, like the birth of a child, and more of the mother's attention now is going to the child, less toward the husband, which upsets that previously existing balance, which in some families can result in the greater conflict between the parents as the father is feeling shortchanged and the mother's feeling underappreciated. That can translate into distance there, with father perhaps spending more time at work or even having an affair in more extreme cases. And then the intensity between the mother and the child becoming more intense as the husband distances in the relationship or as the conflict heats up. Under these circumstances, there's more anxiety transmitted, as indicated by the little stars in the child, as they're less able to work toward resolving their emotional dependence, their attachment to the mother and really the pair, because the father's playing his part by reactively distancing. And that's called the family projection process. Degree of emotional cutoff comes in all degrees, from fairly mild, where there's contact, not terribly personal, but contact more intense, less contact, even less personal. And when that happens, there's more anxiety that has to be handled in the nuclear family is represented by the 4 stars as opposed to the 2 stars under a lesser degree of cutoff. And then under more cutoff yet, there's even more anxiety that has to be handled in the nuclear family that's generated by the unresolved attachment to the original family that's handled with cutoff. Well, predicting the outcome of family therapy, Bowen theory enables clinicians to formulate a series of conditional predictions for each clinical family they see, based on an accurate assessment of the intensity of the unresolved emotional attachment to the original family, the patterns of functioning within the nuclear and extended family, cutoff and the 4 mechanisms, and the ability of the therapist to carry out a course of therapy consistent with theory. That's real important. So the predictability of the family emotional system makes possible a series of if-then predictions. For example, if anxiety comes down in a family, the emotional stuck-togetherness will relax a bit and symptoms will begin to attenuate. If people are able to increase meaningful contact with their family of origin, then anxiety will come down in the nuclear family, which in turn will also attenuate the severity of symptoms in the nuclear family, unless the family experiences additional stressors that heighten acute anxiety in the system. If a person is able to modify their part in a key fixed triangle in specifiable ways, then the emotional system becomes more flexible, less stuck together, and the family is better able to adapt to stress. And if people over time are able to differentiate more of a self in their family of origin and resolve some of the unresolved emotional attachment to the original family, then the underlying adaptiveness to stress in the nuclear family will improve. However, anxiety will increase and symptoms may get worse during initial efforts to function as more of a separate self with the original family. Predictions for outcome in therapy also have to be conditioned on the functioning of the therapist. The therapist must be able to think systems about the family, remain emotionally neutral with a family, convey systems thinking in a way it can be heard by the family, and define and de-triangle self as needed with the family. Now, we could do a whole day on each of those as they factor into the therapist's functioning. But that emotional neutrality is real important. When the therapist is thinking systems, they're not taking sides. They're trying to recognize and understand the part each person's playing in the problem, being in good contact with the family, but not either trying to jump in and solve it, nor get too distant, where the family doesn't think the therapist even comprehends what they're up against. Judgment about when to convey systems ideas to the family, when they can hear it, when anxiety is not too high. And the therapist, him or herself, being able to define what the therapist is prepared to do or not do, and to signal to the family that they are not taking sides in the tension in the family, even though there are plenty of invitations to do so from the family. Another variable that's important is the motivation of at least one member of the family to work on themselves, and that needs to be taken into account in predicting the outcome of a course of therapy. If nobody's picking up the challenge to begin to focus on themselves and their part in the problem, nothing much happens in the family other than they may get some relief from talking about their stuckness to the therapist. There are also predictions about outcome when the use of anxiety binding mechanisms change. If one or more of the adaptive mechanisms in a nuclear family and extended family no longer absorb as much of the undifferentiation in a family unit, and the basic level of differentiation doesn't change, then the use of the remaining mechanisms will become more intense in managing the undifferentiation of the unit. And this is even more likely if additional stressors further upset the emotional equilibrium of the unit. So you can have a family where there's a significant marital problem and a significant amount of child focus on a young adult. And over several years, the couple, managed to tone down their problems with each other, but without changing their basic level of differentiation. A problem in the young adult son of moderate drinking becomes much more severe, and the anxiety of the parents gets more focused on that child, and the moderate problem of drinking becomes a severe problem of drinking. People who managed to quit drinking, the family had anticipated applauding a development like that, but if the basic level doesn't change, the marriage may start to heat up because now the alcoholic is more present and less toned down by the drinking. So the idea is that there's a fixed amount of undifferentiation absorbed in these four mechanisms, and improvement in one can result in exacerbation of the use of one or more of the others. And the other factor is that the better the clinician understands the functioning of the unit, the more accurate the predictions can be. So you both have to understand theory and how the particular family you're seeing actually functions. Now here's a couple more diagrams. Where here's the individuality, here's the togetherness force in different balances at different levels and under different levels of anxiety. Less anxiety, better functioning, higher functional range, more pseudo-self to kind of bolster functioning, but under greater levels of anxiety, the person and the family often, but certainly the person is less adaptive, more apt to lose pseudo-self, and lose the ability to function as an individual, while the togetherness force becomes stronger and more difficult to counterbalance. And to add a few more variables, when there's more anxiety, functional level decreases. When there's more cutoff, anxiety increases and functioning declines. There are more intense triangles as these things occur, and there's a loss of pseudo-self. Here, the upper ranges, less cutoff, less intense triangles, fewer symptoms, less anxiety, and gaining of pseudo-self. When solid self can increase, and this is part of the work on self, to develop some conviction, for example, about your part in an intense triangle, and an effort to modify your part in that. If solid self can slowly increase, it shifts the whole functional range up a little bit. And the lows aren't as low, and the better levels of functioning are more in evidence. But if anxiety can come down for some reason, you can also get an improvement in functioning. And if the cutoffs can be bridged, even if differentiation doesn't change, if anxiety can come down, that can give a greater chance for better functioning in the nuclear unit. So this theory that developed over many years by Dr. Bowen did develop in concert with therapy. And so every theoretical idea in the theory, and I haven't covered all of them by any means, has a correlate in therapy and in functioning of an individual or a family in trying to improve their own level of functioning, their own adaptiveness to stress. So this is just a way to try to conceptualize how some of these concepts and variables mutually influence one another, and how change in any one of them can influence the others, both toward more adaptive functioning and toward less adaptive functioning. So I think we have a few minutes for questions, and then we'll take a break, and then I'm going to show you a clinical tape of a woman actually working on herself, informed by theory. Any questions on the theory part?
How can we change the basic level of differentiation? By learning Bowen, by counseling, or by whatever means? Thank you.
Well, that's a big question. Well, one is just starting out by trying to become a better observer of these patterns of functioning. When is your anxiety going up? When you make a trip home or in an important relationship. When does it come down? What are the triggers for how you're thinking about the other person and behaving toward them? So you want to start just by becoming a better observer. And then as you learn more about triangles and the ability to distinguish between when you're thinking more objectively about a situation and when you're reacting more subjectively, learning that distinction, and then eventually being able to guide your behavior in more thoughtful, principled ways in situations where you might have reacted more automatically, subjectively, and emotionally. That's a big part of it. And so it includes both that internal effort to separate and distinguish between objective thinking and subjective feeling and have a choice on which way to go. But when you can do that, you can also work at becoming more of a separate self in important relationships. More able to distinguish when you're reacting to the other person and what they're doing, and when you're able to step back and observe the process and eventually your own part in it, and then develop more of ability to manage oneself differently. So even though you have a lot of programming from the past, we all do, and sensitivities that we carry around with us, by going back and making visits to the original family, trying to be a better observer and learning how those sensitivities came to be, and then gradually trying to override them and function differently based on principle and increased understanding of how the system works. These are all things that can contribute toward gradually developing some conviction about how you want to function in situations that in the past just evoked an intense emotional reaction. And when that becomes sufficiently solidified that, it's not going to be undone by anxiety or pressure, then you're beginning to increase your solid self a bit, and that pushes the functional range up a bit, and you're getting a little more flexibility in those triangles, a little less of a need to use these four mechanisms to handle the undifferentiation, and the like. So it's a combination of things, but it starts out just by trying to be a better observer and looking at your part in things. Yeah. Anybody else? Here. Okay. Got another minute or two if anybody wants to take a shot. Okay, well then let's come back at 4:15 That's 6-7 minutes, and you can see this tape of a woman who's been doing exactly what you asked, trying to work at improving her level of functioning. Okay?